Welcome. I'm Christine Ackerman. I'm the superintendent of schools. I'd like to introduce my colleagues who are here with me today. Andrew, you can go first.
Andrew Lennon, I'm the assistant superintendent for business.
And then Josh.
Josh Coleblock, Director of Technology, Innovation, and Mathematics.
And then Jamie.
Jamie Block, Director of Athletics, Physical Education, and Health.
And Joe Germano will be joining us in just a second. He was just wrapping up a meeting, and so he'll be hopping on the Zoom while we're in the presentation. So let me begin by just pulling up my screen. And so welcome. This is an opportunity for us to share with you the capital projects that will be up for voter consideration on November 29th, and a moment for you to be able to ask us some questions that we can hopefully clarify some information for you at the end of our presentation to help you make a decision on how you choose to participate in that in the voting process on that particular date. So the decision's already been made to move forward and put the propositions in front of the voters, and the purpose of our meetings, and this is our first one, is just to give you enough information so you can make an informed decision. So I just want to just share with you that we have been in conversations around the need to present a capital project to the community since the budget process began in the start of this new year in 2023. And then over the summer, when our architect had done his analysis of our building conditions, we started to meet more frequently to talk about some large scale items that needed to be addressed that couldn't really be addressed in the context of our budget because of our levy limit. And I don't know if you follow educational law or districts and their budgets, ever since the levy limit was put in place, many districts have had to go out and structure improvement projects like this through bonds because there is a limit in the amount of taxes that can be levied in a school on a school district. So bonds have become more and more frequent since that legislation was passed back, I think, in 2010. If you were to do research around how districts in our region, for example, were addressing issues like roofs or major building projects, you'd see that there was an increase in the amount of bonds that had been put in front of communities for consideration as a result of the tax levy limit legislation. So just some history for us. The last time we did a bond to address like the roofs and other infrastructure repairs were in 1994. Many of you probably are aware there was a bond in the year 2000 for Seven Bridges Middle School. And then before I arrived, there was a bond or a capital project bond that was up for consideration that addressed major improvements in all of the 6 buildings on our campus to enhance the instructional environment and to also address the athletic fields, and as well as the Chapel Library, which is a building that is owned by the district and is used by the current library, but we support them in their budgeting process, and we support that facility because it is actually a part of our property. So for your consideration, the Tuesday after Thanksgiving are 2 propositions, and we're going to go over each of these, and my colleagues are going to help me do that in more detail right now. But the first proposition is really about some capital improvements to our buildings and addressing some significant needs that have been brought to the board's attention over the course of at least my 5 years here in the school district. And so I'd like to talk about them in more detail at this time. But you'll see that 71% of the first proposition is really about infrastructure concerns, about the roofs, about HVAC equipment, about technology. And then the next chunk is related to air conditioning. And then the other pieces are about some security recommendations we're making based on our experience at Greeley, addressing some athletic needs that we continue to have, and then improving the conditions in one of our our performing arts production areas. Oops, sorry, I have to go back 1 second. All right, so we're going to start with our roof replacement. So Joe, is he on? Did he jump on?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, so can you talk about what our need is and where we are with in terms of our current roofs on campus?
Sure. So our 3 elementary school roofs are pretty much over 30 years old, past their useful life. They were all replaced at the same time 30 years ago. So that's why they're coming due at the same time. We have been able to manage to keep them past their useful life by good preventive maintenance. But at this point, we're spending a lot of repair money. We've spent $115,000 already since July 1st on just trying to keep up with repairs.
Okay.
So it's essential that we get these replaced.
Thank you, Joe. Okay, and then Josh, could you please talk about the network and fiber optic upgrades?
Sure. So our network infrastructure internally in our buildings was installed well over 20 years ago. And the fiber is an old technology fiber. So we need to run new fiber as well as new wires into our classrooms. And along with that, we're going to wind up upgrading all of our switches and our Wi-Fi technology to a new level of technology in our schools, so that the speeds will go from either 1 gigabyte to 10, and then also future proofing them so that we can go up to 100 gigabyte speeds, so that we can enable all of the instructional aspects of our program and future proof all of that work.
Thank you. Okay, and so I'll talk about the Greeley J Bridge. So the bridge reached its end of life in June, so we had to take it down. So the bridge came down, and we know that this is a thorough way for our students. It connects 2 big crossing points, and we've received a lot of feedback from our Greeley students, from our staff, about the importance of that structure and the accessibility and the connection between the buildings and their movement around campus. So we are recommending that we rebuild that bridge that we had done over the summer. Joe, can you do the paving projects, please?
Sure. So we have been trying to keep up with, we have money in our budget. We've been trying to keep up with the paving, but there's such a large ticket item. We have 2 areas that really need to get replaced right away, which is at West Orchard and a section of Greeley. Thank
you. And Joe, the next one is also yours, the electrical panel and underground feeder replacement.
Sure. So you're looking at that's a panel that is in a pit in the gym building. Those wires run from there all the way to the cafeteria. They were put in the 50s when the building was built, and they're long past their useful life, and concerned that could be a major issue in the future.
Thank you. Okay, and you also have HVAC repairs and replacement all building?
Sure. So just to give you an idea what's on the screen right now, that's an air handler at Bell, and that was put in 1965. So we have a lot of equipment that's operating, but it's very old. It's not as efficient as we want them to be. So we really should replace them, and would cut back on our repair money as well, because it costs a lot to keep these units running. They're so old.
Okay. All right. And so we've had talk about the fire alarm at Greeley. We've had 2 situations since I've been here where we've had to close campus because the fire alarm went off and we weren't able to shut it off because it was malfunctioning. And so we're at the point where it really needs to be upgraded, and there's better equipment out there for us to use to keep our building safer. So we are recommending that we move forward and we upgrade that entire system through this capital project. The system's working, but it has had some issues with it in the past, and we know there's better systems that we could put in place that'll be more effective for this particular space. Joe, playground replacement?
Sure. So we have all of our playgrounds at the elementary schools have a rubber base, and the West Orchard here that you're looking at is beyond its past its useful life, and we need to replace that.
But we also just want to note, like, this is tested every year, so it's safe for kids to be on, but obviously it's not ideal for students to be on, which is why we want to replace it. Correct,
Yes,
Joe?
Yes, sorry, thank you. We do a drop test to ensure every year that it is passing. And as you can see, there's some repairs that we do make every year when we have our inspection.
Okay. All right. So I'll do the Greeley tennis court light pole replacement. So this is not necessarily about lighting up the courts in a different way. The poles are reaching their end of life. One had to come down, another one fell down. And so we've had someone do an analysis on all of our poles out there, and they're safe to be up, but they're going to reach their end of life soon. And we need to, we have a lot of students who play tennis, and we need to have scheduled practices and games late into the evening. And this is, of course, one of our highest used facilities on campus. So we are recommending we move forward and do a full light pole replacement, which will also help with the 2 lights that we've had. And they're very expensive. So that's why we have this in this project. Okay, so I'll do this. So we had a security audit that was done before the pandemic. And one of the recommendations out of that audit was that we put an electronics locking system in at Greeley because of how that space is structured. There's multiple buildings there. And we wanted to have some consistency on how we locked that building down during the day. And based on our experiences there, it's been so effective. We want to expand that to our elementary and middle schools. It's just a much more efficient way in responding when there's just an emergency. Also, the classroom doors need to remain locked during the day. It's really hard for kids and staff to manage our current locking system, particularly K4. This will be much more efficient for students and for staff. And again, it'll increase our safety measures in those other 5 spaces. So we are recommending we move forward with an electronic door locking system throughout the district. Okay, Joe, do you want to talk about the L building and what's happening in there with the interior space versus the exterior space and the air conditioning?
Sure. So the original L space had a center section with classrooms and computer classrooms there, and that was air conditioned. And when the L building was totally renovated, the rest of the air conditioning system wasn't installed for various reasons at the time. But that unit is being overworked at the moment and is not producing adequate air conditioning. It's probably eventually just going to burn itself. The entire area should be air conditioned, and it'll be much more efficient.
Okay, so I'll talk about the cafeterias and gyms. So one of the discussions that we had early on in our meetings with the Board of Education was talking about concerns that have been brought to the board's attention over the course of many years here. And of course, one of them have been our facilities and how hot the buildings become when the temperature is elevated. So we have heat alleviation plans in place for all 6 of the buildings, which can be found online, but we don't have many spaces in our buildings that have air conditioning that can support those plans more effectively. So we talked about, do we ask the community to consider a bond to air condition the full facilities, all 6 facilities? We felt like that was just way too expensive. So the board asked us to get pricing on air conditioning larger spaces so more kids could move in there during days that are extremely hot for class. And we could add those as additional cooling spaces for students. So that's what we have in this bond for your consideration. The other thing that happened this summer, which was new for us, is I had to cancel an event inside in the gym because we reached like the heat index threshold for sports. There's like a matrix that we use. And if you reach that threshold, you can't have indoor events unless there's air conditioning in there. So I had to something had to be rescheduled. So we started to think about, well, what would the impact of that be on our student athletes if we had to do that during the school year? So that's the reason why air conditioning is included in these plans, but it's not included to the extent where we're asking you to consider supporting air conditioning throughout all of our spaces in all 6 of our buildings. Okay, so I can talk about the outdoor bathrooms at Greeley. So we've had a lot of feedback around our bathrooms that are right outside Seafield because they're really constructed like a large porta-john. And so this is probably one of the only facilities I've been in, and I've been to many high schools, right, that doesn't have a working outdoor bathroom with water, that's water-based. And so one of the recommendations in this capital project is to move towards a working bathroom system down by the concession stand that's water-based for our community to use. Right now, because of we have to contract out to have this cleaned. So we see a cost saving because we'll be able to bring that back onto campus and have our own staff clean that facility, because the tank has to be pumped. And part of the tank being pumped is the facility being cleaned by an outside organization. And so, these are, hindsight's 2020. This isn't something that I was a part of initially when it was decided to put this in, but I definitely feel like this is an opportunity for us to address something that's been a concern brought to our attention by multiple people who use our facilities. And I just want to remind you, our facilities used almost 6 or 7 days a week in the fall and in the spring. So this is something that many of our students and parents will be able to benefit from. Auditorium upgrades. So Joe, did you want to talk about this space, since you helped facilitate the analysis of it based on feedback we received from the community during last year's budget process?
Sure. So in the auditorium, the stage lighting, it dates back probably over 25, 30 years. It's pretty much not usable. And every time there is a performance, the district has to rent equipment. So it would be great to change that out. Also, there's rigging that lowers and upper, brings up and down the curtains and also the lights. And that hasn't been upgraded in probably over 30 years as well, and definitely needs work. And the stage curtains have passed their useful life. So those are the big things that would really help the auditorium and make our performances better, and actually probably save money in the end.
Okay, so Jamie, would you like to talk about the storage concerns that we're having at Greeley?
So storage is a premium, and we have a large investment made into our equipment and our supplies, and keeping them protected is a priority for us. One, they're expensive pieces of equipment, but also will lengthen their life. So anywhere we can store equipment in a proper, safe area will just extend the life of all the stuff that we have, be it from outdoor equipment to even some of our indoor stuff. We're just very limited in our building of where we're keeping all of our things.
Thank you, Jamie. And so I'll talk about our baseball recommendation here. So we have 4 softball fields and 2 baseball fields, and they're both at Greeley. So what happens is we have typically have a modified baseball team at Bell and at Seven Bridges, and then we have a JV team and we have a varsity team, and all of them are up here trying to use 2 fields where there's no lighting, where we have 4 softball fields. So one of the things that we are asking the community to consider addressing is adding a modified baseball field at Seven Bridges Middle School. That is the best space for it to be able to support our baseball program. Just because we have too much happening in one space and not enough light and not enough field space for it to take place efficiently. Okay, so then the second proposition is something that came out of a huge process before the pandemic that involved 2 security audits. We had a district task force, and we had a Greeley safety task force. We did some surveying of the community. And so we're at the place, and if the pandemic didn't happen, we might have had this conversation and discussion with the board earlier, but we're at a place where we are presenting to you the recommendation that we have a single point of interest at Horace Greeley High School, so that during the school day, students and parents and visitors all funnel through one place, like in our other 5 buildings, and are checked in appropriately and head into the spaces through a very secure process. Now, some of the questions I've been getting around that is, what is this going to look like? Or what does this mean, during the arrival and dismissal process? So we're one of the very few school districts that doesn't have a single point of entry. And should the community move forward to support this, then we would have an engineer design what that would look like, and that would be a process. But we're not going to go into that process until we know whether or not the community would support us allocating funding to have a single point of interest. So we put this as a standalone proposition for your consideration, because we really feel like it should be that. I know that people have different opinions on whether or not they feel like a single point of entry would impact the feel of the building. And I understand that. And I know that's all important, but it's also important that we follow the advice of our security experts and present to you a recommendation that's been made through many different data points for your consideration based on what we know about school safety. And so that's what we're doing. So this is also for your consideration moving forward. And so now Andrew's going to talk about the finances associated with both propositions.
Thank you, Dr. Ackerman. So one of the questions, of course, that come up quite often when we talk about a bond is what is this going to cost the taxpayer? So this slide is meant to talk about the marginal tax impact. What are the taxpayers going to feel above what they currently pay in their taxes based on these propositions? And because we've got multiple scenarios, we've got multiple dollar amounts that may result. So making some assumptions, we had a median sales price according to multiple different real estate websites, that the median sale price was about 1.25 million this past summer for a home in Chappaqua Schools. So we use that as a starting point. We're going to make an assumption that the homes are also receiving basic star exemptions, which is a school tax relief law by the state where assessments are adjusted down for school taxes to save taxpayers some money in their tax bill. So for an average home or a median home, of 1.25 million, if both Proposition 1 and 2 pass, over the first 6 years, the average annual cost would be $451 per homeowner. If Proposition 1 passes, but Proposition 2 fails, and Proposition 2 being that centralized entrance for Greeley, the cost over that 6-year period would be about $232 per homeowner. And then if Proposition 1 fails, but 2 passes, because of our existing debt schedule, there will be no marginal tax increase under this current proposal for a homeowner. Of course, there's a fourth option, and that would be if neither pass, and then we continue with our current financing. It is important to just note that this is for a median home. I did do some further research on average assessed values, and the average assessed home might be slightly lower than that number, but we want to be very transparent on what the potential impacts could be. This chart in front of you shows what our existing tax levy contribution towards facilities improvements is at the current moment. So we fund our operations and maintenance budget. We have a transfer to capital for specific projects that are a separate line item in the budget. We also have older projects, including our EPCs or energy performance contracts and capital bond projects that have a debt stream, principal and interest that we're paying. Those numbers are all offset by building aid. And that is what you see here is the net impact to the tax levy with that building aid offset. On the left-hand side, if you just go back 1 second, Christine, the box in orange assumes two things. We had $600,000 in our current year's budget for capital improvements. You might remember that was to supplement the previous year's funding to do the West Orchard roof. And we're assuming in next year's budget, because of our declining debt, we will have an increase in capital appropriations, but the tax levy impact will be neutral. So the third year is the year where you'll start to see the debt related to this bond conversation come on board if it was passed. So on the next chart, this is Proposition 1 only, and you'll see there's a $33.5 million construction cost as well as $447,000 for capitalized interest. That's to help us offset the levy impact in that first year, while building aid will be lagging for half a year following. And those first 6 years cause us to be above that black line. And that black line is representing what the current tax levy support of our building projects is at the current moment. And that 6-year period is what we use as comparison. So this is a much further expanded view of the summary I gave 3 slides earlier. You'll see if just Proposition 1 passes, a basic star exemption on a home of about $1.25 million market value. The payment per year is $232. And if you have no star, or if you happen to have a home that you bought after the phase-in for the star rebate checks that come from the state rather than the assessment reduction, the payment will be $238 per year. The next slide is what would happen if Proposition 2 only passes, and you'll see that because of that declining debt I spoke about earlier, we will stay below that $6.1 million funding level, so there'll be no marginal tax impact in that scenario. And that's just expanding that right there. So on the next slide, you'll see if both propositions pass. I want to be very transparent, right? If both propositions pass, there is a much longer period of time that we would be above that black line, about 14 of the 17 years. The average cost of that would be a much smaller number than the $451 example I gave you earlier. But to compare Proposition 1 and Proposition 1 plus Proposition 2 properly, I wanted to focus on the largest impact to the taxpayers, which is over that first 6-year period. And that is in the example I gave earlier. Basic star exemption for a home price of $1.25 million will be about $451 per year over that 6-year period. And that is, again, another view of that same slide. Of course, if your home value is less than $1.25 million, we've given you some reference points. And if your home is more than $1.25 million market value, you'd see some reference points below that circle that I've highlighted. And this is more about my clarification on the 14 years that we would be over that current level. We'll see this slide later.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Andrew. So now I just want to go over our timeline and then we'll take questions. So we're in the information session part of our process. So we've had on the 3rd, the board adopted the referendums, and we have to publish our legal notice on the 15th, which we are ready to do. But we're now in this place where we're having information sessions all the way up until the night before the bond vote. And so this is our first one, and then we have 6 in our buildings, and then we'll have one more webinar, and then we'll leave it up to you on the Tuesday after Thanksgiving to decide how we're going to move forward here. If either of the propositions are successful, then we'll start the process of working with the state education department to have them approve our plans to move forward with the work, and then we'll begin construction as soon as possible. And so, again, these are just the meetings. If you'd like to attend one of the meetings in person, they're at all of our 6 buildings throughout October and November, and you're welcome to do that. And again, we'll have one more webinar at 7 p.m. on November 28th. And so you can also find information on our website, right on our homepage. If you click on this picture, you'll get the board's latest letter and a link to every presentation that we've given on the capital projects. So you can review that at your leisure. And so I'm going to stop my screen share and we're going to answer questions from the chat. All right. So Andrew, can you talk about how KD&G comes to the prices that they attach to each particular item within the in the capital project?
Yeah, sure. So unlike most corporations, we don't go out and get multiple bids kind of in the planning process. We have to wait for our projects to be approved. So what we've done is we've worked with our architects who have experience doing similar projects throughout the region, and they've used their expertise and their cost database to help us kind of put an initial price on there. Joe Gramundo, our facilities director, then further worked with them to really refine some of the assumptions that they were making. Now, some assumptions may be on actual written quotes that we've gotten from different vendors, like our IT vendor, but others are based on square footage assumptions for things like roofing replacement and the like. So there's different methods that we've used for that cost estimate.
All right. Now, Andrew, there's questions in here about, we've been hearing from our community about the equalization rates, and that's not something, of course, that we have control over. So if community members have a question about if the equalization rates will impact the predicted,
would you like me to give an overview on equalization rates?
Can you look at the, instead of me, can you restate it? Because it's a really important question about how can we share bond information on the finances when the tax equalization rate is so different between the two communities? So go ahead.
Okay, so what is an equalization rate? Let me start there, right? So our school district encompasses homes in two different towns with two different assessing authorities, and they were assessed at different times in history. So the values of a standard home in the town of Newcastle and the same home in the town of Mount Pleasant might be assessed differently. So the state gathers information from the assessors and property sale information to create what's known as an equalization rate, so that when jurisdictions like school districts have to levy taxes across multiple assessing units or areas, that the full value of the homes can more fairly allocate the tax levy that's necessary. And a school district is only able to control our budgets and our tax levy when we're doing our budget making process. How then that number gets split amongst the towns is really a function of assessed values that are done by the towns and the equalization rate that is issued by the state. So I think the issue, based on other conversations I've had with members of our community, particularly in the Mount Pleasant side of the town, is the equalization rate from the state tells me that the value of the properties in Mount Pleasant have outpaced the value growth in our Newcastle section of our school district. The trouble with that is there are different sections of Mount Pleasant that all play into that equalization rate. So circling back to the question, how can we make references to what we think the tax impact will be? It is a fair point, but there are many assumptions that we are forced to make when we're doing any of these. We talked a moment ago about cost estimating. That is one. Building aid assumptions are another, as well as interest rates on the bond that we eventually issue. So to isolate any one of those variables and try to really give 100% faith to it, it's very difficult because there are so many variables that go into it. But I think it is fair to say that we've taken a conservative approach based on recent values and how the property values in each town have grown in the figures we've used to present taxpayer impact in these slides.
So there's a lot of questions and comments in the chart. So I just, some of them are just statements. And so appreciate everyone has an opinion on how we're moving forward here, but this is not a time where we would be changing our direction. So it's already been decided there's going to be two propositions for your consideration up to vote, and this is what they are, right? So you make a decision on how you want to vote based on information that we provide you. And so while I can read some elevated comments in here about some frustrations around a whole host of issues, I completely appreciate that. That's why you have a voice and a vote in how and the direction that the district moves forward in on November 29th. But it's not, we're not changing the plan based on any feedback we're receiving in the chart. The time to give feedback to the board has already passed. And so some of the things I feel very comfortable answering because I feel like it's information that you need to make a good decision is there's a question about the single point of entry in COVID. There's been no Department of Health guidance that would indicate that single point of entries increase the spread of COVID. And there's been no recommendations about not having single point of entries because of a pandemic or a flu-like illness. So while I can understand that could be a very reasonable concern, there's no data from the Department of Health that would suggest that we should move in a different direction. There's a question here about a board member had asked for some heat alleviation numbers at the last meeting, and we didn't have we didn't track that data. Like I couldn't tell you how many days the temperature in the classroom were above 85 because that wasn't something that we were keeping track of. Snow days are easy because we have to log them in a system. So we did the best we could to provide some information to the board about the heat and the heat index patterns. We use the temperature of 80 because when it hits 80, usually the temperatures in some of our hotter classrooms climb up to 85, which would trigger kids moving into cooling spaces. So that was not a factor in the decision to move forward with air conditioning. That decision was placed into the consideration back in August. So I just want to be transparent about that. I wouldn't, that we did the best we could with information that we had to answer a question, but that wasn't a driving force at all in the decision. That information I presented in the decision to move forward with air conditioning. So I just want to be clear about that. Joe, there's some questions about how do you offset the costs in your budget for like new equipment and air conditioning based on some of the things that we feel like we may do in terms of updating the equipment. So do you want to just talk a little bit about that?
Sure. There's a lot of variables that we, could consider, but we would need more time to put together. There's obviously going to be repair cost savings because the equipment that we're replacing, even if we're just putting, we're putting air conditioning into the cafeterias, you have to remember that equipment is ancient as well. So if those air handlers need to be replaced, they're costing me a lot of money to run them. If air conditioning goes into that space, I'm going to have savings in my repair lines. Does that answer it at all?
Yeah, I think that's great. And if you have more questions about that, you can just reach out to Andrew and he can answer those for you. So there's a question here about breaking this up into like smaller propositions. We started with that. We had 3. And the board made the decision to move them into 2. We felt like Grilly needed to be a standalone for a whole bunch of reasons, which I think are pretty self-explanatory. And then the board decided it made sense to move everything into proposition 1 into one proposal instead of 2. So that was a decision that was made back in August. All right, so there's a question about if we move into a single point of entry, do we anticipate having some additional security adjustments to Greeley? And the answer to that is absolutely. But before we go down that path, we need to understand, if the community wants us to move in that direction. We have a lot of security working because we don't have a single point of entrance. So we would make some adjustments to our staffing and to some of our procedures if we had that single entry point. But it's premature for us at this point to talk about that, I think, with the community. Let me just go through. I want to make sure we've talked about taxes. We've talked about the taxation and equalization rate. And let me just make sure I have everything. Okay, so I think that's most of the questions that we have answered. Again, after this meeting, if you want to reach out to us, you can certainly reach out to me or Andrew, and we can do our best to either answer your questions or get Josh, Joe, and Jamie involved in the conversation. But we appreciate you all coming tonight. I appreciate everyone that asked questions and gave us your feedback. And we have different other opportunities. So if you have more questions, please join us at one of the building meetings, or join us at our last meeting, which is another webinar. But thank you all for attending tonight, and we'll put a recording of this online so you can review it again at your leisure. So thank you all. Have a great evening, and we appreciate you being with us. Thank you.